If you have ever watched your only child's breath turn to frost on his own eyelashes inside his own bedroom, then you know exactly what it feels like to look at a wooden wall and see a harbinger of death. For Silas Vance, that terrifying reality had spent the last several months looming over him like the granite shadow of the Medicine Bow Range. It was late September of 1888, and the wind blowing down from the Wyoming summits carried a sharp, crystalline chill that every experienced settler in the valley recognized. The mountain peaks were already white, and the old-timers whispered that an early, brutal winter was rapidly approaching. Silas was a quiet, deliberate man who had spent years working as a Union Civil War wagon master and later as a railroad surveyor. He had measured the grades of the mountains and mapped the pathways of the wild country, learning early on that nature does not negotiate with human stubbornness. But his greatest challenge was not the wilderness. It was the fragile boy sitting by the hearth inside his rough-hewn log cabin. His 7-year-old son Leo had a fragile chest. The previous winter had been an ordeal of endless, rattling coughs and burning fevers that kept Silas awake for nights on end, listening to the fragile sound of his son's lungs struggling for air. Silas had lost his wife, Sarah, to that same lung fever during their first bitter year on the frontier, and he had sworn a silent, solemn oath to her memory that he would not let the cold claim their son. The cabin Silas had constructed on his homestead was solid enough by normal standards. He had cut the lodgepole pines himself, notched them with a heavy felling axe, and packed the gaps with mud and moss. But Silas was a surveyor, a man who understood how forces moved. He had watched the wind blow against the logs, and he realized a fundamental truth that his neighbors ignored. A log cabin, no matter how thick the timber, is constantly losing a battle against the wind. The wood itself is porous, and the wind does not simply find the gaps in the chinking. It scours the heat directly off the outer surface of the logs through convective cooling. Every cold blast hitting the cabin was actively pulling the warmth out of the room faster than his stone fireplace could ever hope to replace it. Silas knew that if he did not find a way to stop the wind from touching the wood, the drafty, damp chill of the coming winter would eventually claim Leo's fragile lungs. He needed a shield, something that would break the wind before it ever reached the timber, creating a pocket of stillness around their entire home. With his mind made up, Silas hitched his mule and traveled down the mountain trail to the supply depot at Elk Mountain Station. The air in the valley was crisp, filled with the scent of curing hay and wood smoke as other settlers prepared for the season. But Silas's destination was not the grain elevator or the blacksmith. He walked directly into the government surplus warehouse, a cavernous space smelling of coal oil, raw wool, and grease. He spent nearly his entire remaining savings, $40, an amount that would have purchased a winter's worth of flour, salt pork, and dried beans on 70 yards of heavy, double-duck cargo canvas. It was the same robust fabric used by the overland freight companies to cover their heavy transport wagons, rendered entirely waterproof and windproof by a thick treatment of boiled linseed oil. The fabric was stiff, greasy to the touch, and carried a pungent, earthy smell of flax and oil. The depot manager, a talkative man who knew every homesteader in the district, watched with amusement as Silas hauled the massive, heavy rolls out to his pack mule. A few local ranchers, who had gathered around the stove to escape the morning chill, began to grin and whisper. "What are you building up there, Silas?" one of them called out, tipping his hat back. "You planning to sail that cabin of yours down the river? Or are you just getting ready to sleep in a tent when the logs freeze?" Silas did not rise to the bait. He quietly secured the heavy rolls to the pack saddle with thick hemp rope, checking each knot with the methodical patience of an old wagon master. He knew that the $40 he had spent was a gamble, but he also knew that the traditional way of fighting the winter-burning pile after pile of wood in a drafty cabin was a losing game. Before we reveal how Silas turned these greasy rolls of fabric into a shield that defied the mountain, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Every week, we bring you stories of quiet frontier survival and traditional wisdom that history forgot techniques that were paid for in resilience and common sense. Now, let's look at how Silas began his strange construction. Silas led his heavily laden mule back up the steep trail to his claim, the sharp flax oil scent of the canvas filling his nose. He could hear Leo's distant, soft coughing from the cabin as he approached, and the sound reinforced his resolve. The townspeople could laugh all they wanted, but Silas was not building for their approval. He was building to keep his son alive. The next morning, Silas began the physical labor of wrapping his home, working alone under a pale autumn sky. He began by carving dozens of small wooden spacers from scrap pine, making each one exactly 4 inches thick. He nailed these spacers directly to the log walls, at regular intervals around the entire perimeter of the cabin. His goal was to create a precise, continuous 4-inch gap between the outer canvas and the inner logs. Silas's training as a surveyor had taught him that still air is one of the most powerful natural insulators on Earth. If he could trap a column of completely motionless air between the cold outer canvas and the warm wooden logs, the convective currents that normally strip the cabin of its heat would be stopped entirely. Over the spacers, Silas mounted horizontal pine laths, creating a light, flexible framework that surrounded the cabin like a cage. Then, he began the heavy work of hanging the canvas. The linseed-soaked fabric was stiff and unyielding in the autumn chill, requiring Silas to use his full body weight to pull each sheet taut over the wooden laths. He hung the canvas in vertical sheets, overlapping each section by 6 inches and securing the seams with heavy brass eyelets and tarred cord. He made sure there were no horizontal seams where the wind could catch the fabric and tear it away. At the roofline, he guided the canvas up and over the eaves, securing it tightly to the roof beams with thick rope to form an unbroken weather barrier. Finally, Silas dug a shallow trench around the entire foundation of the cabin. He pulled the bottom hem of the canvas down into the trench, secured it with heavy stakes, and packed the ditch with dense, wet clay. This sealed the bottom of the air pocket completely, preventing the cold mountain wind from slipping underneath the fabric and deterring rodents from nesting in the warm void. His neighbors, including a wealthy rancher named Samuel Hendricks and a neighboring homesteader's wife named Clara Finch, frequently rode past his property. They would stop their horses at the fence line, pointing and laughing at the sight of the strange, gray, wrapped structure. Vance's tent, Vance's Folly, his dwelling wrapped up like a dolly, the school children sang the next day, having heard their parents jesting at the dinner table. Silas simply watched them pass, checked the tension on his ropes, and went inside to sit with Leo in the quiet, drafty cabin, waiting for the mountain to deliver its verdict. The local skepticism found its strongest voice in Thad Greer. Greer was a wealthy, influential builder who had constructed the largest, most expensive log cabins in the valley. He was a man who believed in the absolute authority of his own experience, and he prided himself on building structures that looked solid, heavy, and traditional. He rode into Silas's yard on a brisk October afternoon, his horse's hooves crunching loudly on the frozen grass. He dismounted, walked up to the canvas wall, and poked the stiff fabric with a thick finger. "You've built yourself a real circus tent here, Silas," Greer said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who believed he had nothing left to learn. "I've built 20 cabins in this territory, and I've never seen a man wrap his home in oilcloth. Wood needs to breathe, Silas. You trap the moisture inside those logs with that greasy canvas, and you'll have rot eating your sills before the spring thaw. The first real gale coming off the medicine bow will tear this fabric into ribbons." Silas stood on his porch, a wood plane in his hand, his expression calm and unbothered. "The wood has plenty of room to breathe, Thad," he said quietly. "The canvas is 4 inches off the logs. It's the still air that keeps us warm. The cloth is just there to stop the wind from moving it." Greer snorted, shaking his head as he stepped back toward his horse. "Still, air won't keep a child warm when the temperature drops to 30 below, Silas. You're playing with fancy ideas you brought from the East. Out here, survival is about thick spruce logs, mud chinking, and a roaring fire. You're risking that sick boy's health on a foolish experiment, and there's no room for foolishness in a Wyoming winter." Silas looked down at Leo, who was watching from the window, his pale face pressed against the glass. Silas did not argue. He knew that Greer's understanding of construction was based on tradition, not the physical laws of heat transfer. He simply turned back to his work, adjusting the tension on the corner ropes, confident that the coming cold would provide all the argument he needed. As October faded into November, the social distance between Silas's family and the rest of the valley grew. The homesteading community was close-knit, bound together by shared hardships and a common way of living. But Silas's strange wrapped cabin had made him an outsider. Clara Finch, a woman who prided herself on her family's rugged, traditional lifestyle, led the local whispering. At the schoolhouse social and the weekly community gatherings, she would speak loudly about how some folks didn't seem to have the necessary grit for the frontier. Some people think they can buy their way out of hard work, with fancy contraptions and soft living, Clara said to a group of women as they gathered around the stove. They wrap their homes in blankets because they're too soft to split the wood it takes to keep a proper cabin warm. My family has survived 3 winters here, without any canvas shacks, and we'll survive this one too, the honest way. The children took their cues from their parents. At the schoolhouse, little Leo found himself standing alone during recess, the other boys refusing to play with the child who lived in the tarpaulin house. He came home one afternoon with tears in his eyes, asking Silas why they couldn't live in a normal cabin like everyone else. Silas sat his son down on a wooden bench, wrapping his arm around the boy's thin shoulders. Leo, when you're surveying a railroad line, you don't build the track where it's easiest. You build it where the physics say the train can climb. The folks in the valley build their homes the way they've always seen them built, but they're fighting the wind instead of using it. You trust me. This cabin is going to keep us warmer and safer than any house in this valley, and we won't have to spend our whole winter splitting wood to do it. Silas's actions seemed to back up his words, though his neighbors saw it as further proof of his impending failure. While the other homesteaders spent every daylight hour hauling and stacking massive piles of firewood, 6, 7, even 8 cords of pine, Silas stacked only 3 cords in his small woodshed. Vance is going to freeze out by January, the men at the trading post whispered, watching him buy only a small supply of kerosene. He hasn't got half the wood he needs. The man's completely unprepared. The warning came in the 2nd week of November. Silas woke at dawn to find the Medicine Bow Range entirely invisible, swallowed by a massive, slate-gray wall of cloud that stretched across the northern horizon. The air was eerily still, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and expectant, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. By noon, the sun was a pale, sickly disk, hanging in a sky that had taken on a faint, greenish hue. Every experienced rancher in the valley knew what that color meant. It was the mark of a historic, dangerous blizzard, an Arctic air mass dropping out of Canada with enough force to bury the territory. Josiah Crenshaw, the old fur trapper who had spent 3 decades in the high country, rode through the valley on his buckskin horse. He did not stop to jest. He knocked on every door, his face grim beneath his beaver-skin cap. "A bad one is coming," Crenshaw warned Silas, leaning down from his saddle. "The wind's going to come straight off the ice fields, and it's going to blow for days. Bring your stock inside, stack your wood by the hearth, and don't plan on stepping past your door until it clears." Silas thanked the old man and went to work. He conducted a thorough, organized inspection of the canvas envelope. He checked the tension on every rope, made sure the clay ceiling at the foundation had hardened, and inspected the overlaps on the windward side. Everything was secure. Inside the cabin, Silas built a small, efficient fire in the stone fireplace, using only 3 medium-sized logs of dry pine. He closed the heavy wooden door, secured the latch, and sat down at the table with Leo. The thermometer on the wall read a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the green sky darkened into an unnatural, premature twilight. The air grew colder by the minute, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in less than an hour. The valley went completely silent, waiting for the first blow of the storm. The storm struck at exactly 9 o'clock that evening. It did not build slowly. It arrived with the sudden, violent impact of a physical blow. A massive squall, with winds that Silas estimated at over 60 miles per hour, slammed directly into the northern wall of the cabin. The heavy cargo canvas billowed inward with a deep, echoing boom, like the sail of a great ship catching a sudden gale. But the horizontal pine battens and the vertical spacers held the material firm, distributing the tremendous wind pressure evenly across the entire timber structure. There was no tearing, no straining of the eyelets, only a steady, low vibration that settled into a distant, rhythmic hum. Inside the cabin, the effect was almost miraculous. Silas sat by the hearth, watching the draft indicator he had mounted on the mantel. The air inside remained completely still. The draft that normally whistled through the log seams, blowing out candles and chilling the room at ankle height, was entirely absent. The 4-inch pocket of trapped air was doing its job, absorbing the wind's force and preventing the convective currents from stripping the heat off the logs. The thermometer on the wall held steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas added only one small log to the fireplace every 2 hours, a fraction of the fuel he would have burned in a standard cabin. The warmth did not escape through the walls. It stayed in the room, radiating evenly from the stone hearth. Leo sat on his bedroll, his face flushed with a healthy, warm color. He was not wearing his heavy wool coat or wrapping himself in layers of blankets. He was playing quietly with a set of carved wooden blocks, his breathing deep, steady, and free of the dry, rattling wheeze that had plagued him all through the previous winter. Silas climbed the small ladder to the attic loft, checking the temperature near the roofline. It was warm and dry, with no condensation forming on the interior timber. The canvas was blocking the wind, but its natural permeability was allowing the interior moisture to migrate outward, preventing the sweatbox effect that the local builders had predicted. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, driving the snow horizontally across the prairie. The temperature had plummeted to 20 below zero, and the wind chill made it feel like 40 below. But inside the tarp-wrapped cabin, the world was quiet, warm, and safe. While Silas and Leo rested in stable warmth, the rest of the Medicine Bow Valley was entering a desperate fight for survival. The blizzard was relentless, the wind scouring the plains and burying the homesteads under massive shifting drifts of snow. At the Hendricks cabin, less than a quarter-mile to the north, Samuel Hendricks was living his worst nightmare. The wind had found every gap in his new clay chinking, whistling through the log seams with a high-pitched scream. The cold air swept across the floor, dropping the temperature at ground level to near freezing. Samuel's wood pile was stacked outside under a simple pine lean-to, and the wind-driven snow had coated the logs in a thick layer of ice. Every piece of wood he carried inside was damp and frozen. When he threw them onto the fire, they hissed and steamed, filling the cabin with a thick, acrid smoke that made his children cough and choke. The fireplace was consuming wood at a terrifying rate, yet the house remained cold and damp. At the Finch homestead, Clara Finch and her family were huddled in a tight circle around their cast-iron stove. The stove was red-hot, but the cold draft coming through the uninsulated walls was so strong that the water bucket sitting on the kitchen table had frozen solid. Clara's hands were numb as she tried to wrap her shivering children in every blanket they owned. "I don't understand," Clara whispered, her teeth chattering as she listened to the wind rattling her window frames. "We prepped the cabin just like we always do. We have twice the wood Silas has, and we're still freezing." Her husband, his face pale with exhaustion, did not answer. He knew that the wind was simply too strong. It was stripping the heat off their logs faster than the stove could generate it, turning their sturdy home into a drafty icebox. At the Greer Ranch, the wealthy builder's pride was collapsing along with his structure. A massive gust of wind had caught the wide, flat eaves of his large cabin, ripping several shingles away and cracking the main doorframe. The cold air rushed in, extinguishing his fire and filling his spacious, high-ceilinged rooms with freezing snow. Greer fought to secure the door with heavy timber braces, his fingers turning gray with frostbite as the interior temperature plummeted toward zero. By the second night of the storm, the blizzard had reached its peak. The temperature outside had dropped to 30 below zero, and the wind gusts were reaching hurricane force. The valley was a chaotic, blinding whiteout, entirely cut off from the rest of the world. Samuel Hendricks's wood supply was exhausted, and his fire was a heap of cold, gray ash. His children were crying from the cold, their lips blue, their small bodies shivering uncontrollably. Samuel knew that if they stayed in the cabin until morning, they would not survive the night. "We have to go to Silas's place," Samuel said, his voice desperate as he wrapped his youngest daughter in a heavy buffalo robe. "His cabin is on the rise. It's close. and I saw smoke coming from his chimney before the whiteout hit. Clara Finch's husband had reached the same conclusion. Their stove had begun to backdraft, filling their small home with toxic smoke, and they were freezing in the dark. They bundled their family into their winter gear, tied themselves together with a long rope, and stepped out into the screaming wind. Through the blinding snow, they struggled up the rise, guided only by the distant, steady glow of the kerosene lamp shining through Silas's window. As they neared the homestead, they saw the strange gray shape of the canvas cabin standing firm against the gale, the wind sliding smoothly over its curved corners without catching. Silas heard the faint, desperate knocking on his door over the roar of the wind. He opened it immediately, a wave of warm, 6-8-degree air billowing out into the frozen night. Samuel Hendricks, Clara Finch, and their shivering families stumbled inside, collapsing onto the warm timber floor. They were covered in ice, their faces pinched with cold. But as the warmth of the cabin enveloped them, they let out gasps of relief. Silas did not ask for explanations. He immediately went to work, wrapping the shivering children in dry blankets, heating a pot of broth over the hearth, and helping the adults remove their frozen boots. Thad Greer arrived an hour later, his hands wrapped in bloody rags where the frostbite had taken hold, his pride entirely gone. He sat quietly in the corner of the warm, quiet room, listening to the wind howling harmlessly against the heavy canvas shell outside. And for the first time, he understood the value of the surveyor's gamble. The storm finally broke on the morning of November 14. The wind died down to a gentle breeze, and the sun rose into a clear, quiet sky, reflecting off a valley that lay buried under 4 feet of fresh snow. Inside Silas's cabin, the guests woke to a room that was still comfortably warm. The thermometer on the wall read 64 degrees Fahrenheit, even though Silas had not added a log to the fire since midnight. The families sat around the table, eating hot cornmeal mush, their faces relaxed and warm for the first time in days. Samuel Hendricks looked at the small woodpile remaining in Silas's corner. "Silas, we burned through almost 4 cords of wood in 3 days, and we nearly froze to death. You kept this whole house at 70 degrees, and it looks like you didn't even use a quarter of what we did." Silas nodded quietly, pouring hot coffee into Samuel's tin cup. "The canvas stopped the wind before it could scour the logs, Samuel. The 4-inch pocket of still air held the heat inside, and the logs didn't have to fight the cold. We only burned what we needed to heat the room, not the whole mountain." Thad Greer stood up, his bandaged hands held close to his chest. He walked over to the log wall, pressing his palm against the wood. It felt warm and dry, with no trace of the moisture or frost that had coated his own interior walls. "I spent 20 years building cabins the way my father taught me, Silas," Greer said, his voice quiet and sincere. "I thought thick wood was the only defense we had, but your house stayed 70 degrees warmer than the outside air, on a handful of wood while my castle froze. I was wrong, Silas. I was proud, and I was wrong." Clara Finch looked at little Leo, who was sitting near the hearth, his cheeks rosy, his breathing completely clear. She felt a deep, heavy wave of shame for the words she had spoken at the schoolhouse. "Silas," Clara said, her eyes wet with tears, "we called you soft. We laughed at your cabin and teased your boy because we thought you were too weak for the frontier. But you weren't weak, Silas. You were smart, and you did this to protect your son. If it weren't for this tarp-wrapped house, my children wouldn't have survived the night. I am so sorry." Silas smiled gently, reaching out to pat her hand. "There's nothing to apologize for, Clara. The frontier is a hard teacher, and it doesn't give us many chances to learn. We're all warm, and we're all safe. That's the only thing that matters." The lesson of the 1888 blizzard was not forgotten. By the spring of 1889, the homesteaders who had laughed at Silas's cabin were buying heavy canvas from the supply depot at Elk Mountain Station. James Dalton, the veteran carpenter, partnered with Silas to refine the design, developing an improved batten system that distributed tension more evenly across the fabric. William Good, the former quartermaster, began ordering the heavy duck cloth in bulk, reselling it at cost to new settlers, and helping them install the insulation systems before the first frost. By the winter of 1891, 14 homes in the Medicine Bow Valley were protected by some version of Silas's double-wall envelope design. The tarp-wrapped cabin was no longer a joke. It had become a recognized, respected method of frontier construction, saving fuel, protecting health, and preserving families through the harshest seasons. The change in the valley's building practices was quiet, spreading from neighbor to neighbor without the need for official codes or engineering manuals. It was a practical diffusion of knowledge, born out of a shared crisis and the undeniable proof of a single warm room. Years passed, and the Medicine Bow Valley grew into a prosperous, settled community. The temporary canvas wraps were eventually replaced by more permanent siding, but the principle of the insulated air gap remained at the heart of every home built in the region. Silas Vance stood on the porch of his homestead on a crisp autumn afternoon in 1898. The canvas shell was old and weathered now, showing the gray patina of a decade of exposure, but it was still taut, secure, and functional. His son Leo, now a tall, healthy young man of 17, with strong lungs and a bright, clear voice, was packing a leather trunk onto the back of a wagon, getting ready to travel to Laramie to begin his studies in civil engineering. Leo walked up the steps, wrapping his strong arms around his father's shoulders. "I'm going to learn to build bridges and railroads, Pa," he said, his voice steady and warm. "But I'll never build anything as smart or as important as the shield you built for me when I was 7. Silas held his son close, his eyes wet as he looked across the quiet, warm valley. The gamble he had taken in the fall of 1888 had been paid back in full, not in dollars or recognition, but in the healthy, strong life of his son. The tarp-wrapped cabin on the rise had started as a strange, desperate experiment, ridiculed by a community that trusted only tradition. But in the end, it had proven that survival belongs not to those who fight the elements with brute force, but to those who have the humility to observe, the courage to innovate, and the love to protect what matters most. The legacy of Silas Vance's design survived long after the original canvas had returned to the earth. The principles of the dead air gap and the convective windbreak would eventually be integrated into modern building science, forming the basis of contemporary energy-efficient construction. Today, if you travel through the Medicine Bow Range, you will find no plaques or historical markers dedicated to the surveyor's cabin. The original homestead has been swallowed by the surrounding pine forest, and the old log walls have returned to the soil. But the quiet wisdom of that winter remains. It is a reminder that the best solutions are often the ones born from necessity, tested by adversity, and built with love, a timeless truth that continues to keep us warm long after the storms of the past have cleared.